certainly do appreciate this opportunity to talk about the trip that Carol and I made to Africa. And at the end, I'll say thank you again, but let me say thank you in the beginning for all your support that made the trip possible, not only for me, but for Carol. This was the first time she'd accompanied me on one of my overseas adventures there, and she was a great help in helping keep up with me and keeping up with where I was supposed to be and who I had seen and who I hadn't seen. And I think it made quite an impression on the people there. A number of the studies that we had involved 2 or 3 young ladies. And it was just very nice to have a woman there to be a part of it. So I appreciate her going, appreciate the extra support that enabled her to go. And I thought, where in the Bible do we read about Africa? So I searched for Africa, and I didn't find it in the word search. But then I thought, oh, wait. Ethiopia is in Africa. Egypt is in Africa. The listing of the places that were there, of those of the Jews who assembled in Jerusalem that were there for that great assembly in Acts chapter 2, several of them were from Africa, different parts of Africa. So yes, we read about Africa in the Bible. God's message had gotten into Africa even in that early time. But I think there are quite a number of years that it didn't go there very well. And I'm here to talk about an area of Africa and Tanzania where the gospel message is strong, where there are actually people being trained to preach the gospel in that area. First thing I would mention to you, I guess, about going to Tanzania is it's a long way. Not only is it a long way around the world this way, but it's south of the equator. From here, Carol and I guess I don't have a pointer, flew to John F. Kennedy Airport in New York and stopped in Egypt on the way down to Tanzania, went into Kilimanjaro Airport, close to Mount Kilimanjaro. On the way back, we came back through Amsterdam and Minneapolis, St. Paul. So it really is a long way. When before they let you go south, they make you go north to get out of the U.S. About 10,000 miles each way, about 20 hours worth of flying. So even though we kind of broke it up with a stop in Egypt on the way over and a stop in Amsterdam on the way back, it's a long trip. And you'll see here, as I'll try to kind of focus in exactly where Tanzania is. You see it's right on the boundary line there with Kenya. And if I take kind of a different map, you see those little dots there on the top, the green and the red and the blue? Let me kind of zoom in on that, and then I'm going to put some labels on them. So just south of the border with Kenya, and that dark spot there on this topographical map is Mount Kilimanjaro. To the left is Mount Meru. Those are kind of 2 reference points. But going from right to left, Kilimanjaro Airport, that's where we flew in. Arusha is the Arusha Church of Christ, where I held the gospel meeting over the weekend. And then Kasongo is the place where the Andrew Conley School of Preaching is located. There's also a Church of Christ there. So, as I tell the story here, the first part of the story occurs in Arusha, where we had the gospel meeting, then moved on to Kasongo, where we did most of the daily business. I put Lake Manyara there on the left-hand side. Those of you who are familiar with Bible geography know about the Great Rift Valley that goes through the Dead Sea and down the Jordan Valley, and up the Sea of Galilee. That Great Rift Valley goes about 3,000 miles further south, and it goes through Lake Manyara. Huge geographical formation there. So that's kind of a tie-in, if you will, to the biblical lands also. I thought in the beginning, let me just kind of show you some scenes. I think you kind of want to see some scenes of what Africa's like, so let me just kind of do that all at once in the beginning, and then we'll move on to the spiritual part of the lesson. We arrived at Kilimanjaro Airport. One thing that you see there, it's a pretty place. Many pretty trees, a lot of pretty shrubs that are a part of it. And there we are leaving the airport with all of our bags but one. From Egypt down there, we flew on Ethiopian Airlines. I probably wouldn't recommend you fly on Ethiopian Airlines. They canceled one flight on us, and then when we got there, we had to do with the bag, out of the bag for about 2 days. Maybe fortunately it was one of my bags, but it had my preaching clothes in it. But one of the people there, one of the Americans that was a teacher there, was about my size, so I just impersonated him in dress for the first couple of days, and that was probably a good thing. He was well respected and a good guy. Carol is on the left looking backwards to see where Stan is, and Stan was where Stan usually was, and that was standing someplace taking a picture. The man on the right is Jimmy G. Jimmy G is the person who's the director of the school. And there we are sitting around a table in a restaurant, and except for Carol there in the middle, the rest of that is Jimmy G's family. Even though he's there in a difficult area, several of the children are his, most of them were adopted. And if you can tell by the picture there, some of them are African. Jimmy G and his wife are just kind of a remarkable couple. They have just taken on even more challenges in that area and just seem to roll along and do very well with them. Let me at this time mention a man by the name of Cy Stafford. Jimmy G is the director of the preaching school there, the Andrew Conley School of Preaching. I'll show you some pictures of it in a minute. But the person who's responsible for the Tanzania 2000 mission, 20 to 30-year plan to evangelize people in that part of the world, is Cy Stafford. He wasn't there. And that was kind of good news because we had the opportunity to stay at his place, and that provided a very good place for Carol and me to stay. But I will tell you, between the two of them, as I exchanged emails with them in preparation for this trip, they are as good at responding to emails as any two people I've ever seen. They're very organized, and they were organized for us, not only them, but the people we worked with when we got there. I think the productivity of the trip was much greater because of the organization of people that were there. Jimmy G was one of them. Let me just show you some of the scenes. You kind of have the rural areas and some that don't look like the lower end of the poverty scale. You see some things that you might have seen in this country, I don't know, maybe 100 years ago. You see some things that were cultural. They carried the things on the top of their head. And I'll show you some of the places where they lived, but most of them did not have running water. So one of the things that they had to carry a lot of was water back and forth to their dwelling places. As you got more into the cities, the town of Arusha is a town of about 1.2 million people. Very large metropolitan area. Toward the outskirts, it looks like poor areas. The further you get into the city, the more it would look like a city in the U.S. Some very modern facilities. I would say in general, they seem to be cleaner, neater, more modern than maybe places that we visited in India or places that we visited, even in South America. And they had restaurants that we could eat in there. And that's not always the case in some countries. And that's kind of nice to have a little bit of diversity of the things that you eat. In Arusha, that's the clock tower at the square. And everybody seems to know about that but me. But if you watch the movie the movie Atari with John Wayne was shot in this area of Tanzania, and that's the clock tower. So for those of you who are familiar with Atari, there's the clock tower. One of the things that really is a great element of the scenery in that particular area is Mount Meru, 15,000 feet tall. It's probably about 30 miles. I think I took that in the front of the church building there in Arusha. It's a pretty impressive mountain and kind of gives identity, if you will, to that part of Tanzania. The thing that's more impressive than Mount Meru, now this is from the place we were staying, that thing behind the tree there, that's Mount Meru. And if this little video will work, I want you to notice in the scenery in the far back, if you get a picture of this, you had to do it just about daybreak. But as I zoom in, you can kind of see the flowing hills of Mount Meru. And you see that little hump back in the back there? That is Mount Kilimanjaro. Meru is about 15 miles away. Kilimanjaro is 60 miles away. Kilimanjaro, I zoomed in there and colored a little bit different. Largest peak in Africa. One of the big seven, they call it, the largest peak on each continent, 15,000 feet. Some would say it is the highest freestanding mountain in the world. Now, other mountains may go to an ultimately higher altitude, but if you measure from the base of the plain how high it rises directly up, Mount Kilimanjaro is number one, or very close to it. 60 miles away, pretty impressive thing. Now, to the spiritual part of the journey. Arusha Church of Christ was where I was scheduled to hold the gospel meeting on Saturday and Sunday. Had a couple of sessions on Saturday afternoon. I preached the ones that I would very often preach in meetings here in the U.S. One about the plan of salvation was an emphasis on the fact that faith only does not save. And then the second lesson is about worship. It's a lesson that you've heard in bits and pieces several times since I've been here. Why do we do what we do? How is it we piece the Scriptures together to understand that as a part of worship we need to do only what we find in the New Testament? We need to kind of prove that we believe that there is a pattern there that needs to be followed. And that's the kind of logic that I presented in those two lessons on the Saturday afternoon. There's the church building, a very adequate facility there. Some of the people who attended had their kind of normal, I guess, native African dress, very colorful, very interesting to look at. There's Carol on the left, and dressed in U.S. dress, and somebody on the right who was not. There they were preparing the meal, kind of more of an outdoor kitchen than we would have here, but you can see some of them in various kinds of dress as they were working there to prepare the meal. Again, something we were able to eat, and that was good. On the inside, you can see them. You can see the ways they're dressed, although some would have perhaps the more traditional African dress, probably more of them dressed in clothes that would look very much like we do today. And I wanted you to have a chance to hear some of their singing. And their singing is terrific. They sing with a vigor. They sing with an enthusiasm. Let me see if I can get this clip to work. The clip wouldn't seem to work quite out of the PowerPoint file, so I'm going to try to put it on this other file. have any kind of motorized transportation. And this, the congregation there in Arusha is right at the intersection of looks like 3 different railroad tracks. And the railroad tracks became not just a place for the trains to go, it became a place for people to walk also. So you can see them walking, you can see something more of the scenery. I wanted to show you this. They had the most, I say unusual practice. It's probably only unusual because I hadn't seen it before. At the end of the service, as they would all exit the building, they would sing as they did it, but they would walk out the door, and you would walk out the door, and then you would stand by the door, and the next person would come by you, shake your hand, and take their place in line beyond you. And so as they streamed out, they would shake everybody's hand who's gone out before them. They would fall in their place in line, and that way everybody who came out after them would come by them and shake their hand. So what a clever little way of shaking everybody shaking everybody else's hand. So, can't hear the singing as well, but you can see what they're doing. And I thought, except for the guy who was standing out there taking the picture, everybody shook everybody's hand. There was a picture of the sort of the end of the line there. So that was Saturday, Sunday. That was at the Arusha Church of Christ. Now let's kind of shift over to Kasango. That's where I work most of the rest of the time. And what is located there is the Andrew Conley School of Preaching. And it is a very nice facility. As they were explaining at the time that they were building this, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, that I guess they had a very wealthy benefactor. And they have a very nice facility there. Again, you can see some of the pretty scenery around there. I don't know what you think of. Maybe I didn't know what to think of when I thought of Africa, but I didn't think about the beautiful flowers they had there. It's kind of hard to see the facility. It's kind of behind the wall. There's one of the classrooms, for example, on the inside of the facility. Let me back up, if I know how to back up. I wanted to tell you that the School of Preaching, Andrew Conley, it was a little bit of a small world story for me, because when I was growing up in Breckenridge, Texas, and that's where my parents, who were from different denominations, and I found the Lord's Church. And the congregation there in Breckenridge was a good, strong congregation. And the congregation in Breckenridge, this was in the 50s, supported Andrew Conley as he was preaching in Africa. And I remember, one time that he came to the congregation there, maybe to give a report or to preach, and he came out to our house and sat around the table, and it was just interesting. A very large man. And the feeling seemed to be that was good, because the people of Africa would respect somebody of a large size. And the story that I remember about him, and I don't remember whether I heard it from him when he was sitting around the table or from somebody else later, was, when Andrew Conley was there in the 50s, he was going out into the jungles to preach. Sometimes, deep into the jungles and preaching to the people there. Really, it would just be kind of amazing probably for him to see the kind of facilities that are available now. But I guess when he would preach, he would just keep preaching and preaching and preaching. But what the people of Africa would do when they decided he had preached long enough, they just started singing. And that was their way of letting him know that, well, that's enough. So now if I hear singing in the middle of my sermon, why did I tell that story? What was I thinking? But anyway, it was just interesting to me, having seen and met the man, in the mid-50s, probably literally maybe 50 years ago, to see, the fruits of his labor. As people have stayed there. I think they were small for many years, but now not only are there strong churches of Christ in that area, but there's actually a preaching school. And the preaching school, by the way, I guess they've had classes in English up until this time that had to be translated into Swahili, but now they've had enough graduates who have done very well that now some of the graduates, the African graduates of the school, are now teaching the courses in Swahili. Don't have to be translated. And as you can see, it doesn't have to be translated. That saves a lot of time. The preacher at the congregation in Kasongo. Again, not Arusha, but Kasongo, one that's really located very close to the Andrew Common School of Preaching, is Kamaro. And I tell you, Kamaro was a fine young man. He was the preacher there. When we got there, he had visits scheduled, and sometimes we had trouble. Having time to eat, and sometimes we barely got to the services for their midweek Bible study. Those people know how to schedule you to get some useful work out of you while you're there. There's Kimaro, and I'll show you a picture of his family toward the end of the presentation. The other person I'm sure you recognize is Carol. But you see that wall behind them? That wall is significant. Behind that wall is a factory. And I do not know what the economic situation is that brought the factory to that particular area, but what a blessing. Because people were coming from many, many miles around to come there and work in that factory. And who are the people that are the best prospects in terms of evangelism? It's the ones who've been displaced from their family roots or their religious roots, and they're in a different area. And that provided some of the opportunities that we had. I want to tell you something about Kamaro before I forget it. Look at my notes here. Kind of another small world story. When I was preaching up in Buda for 4 years up there, of course the World Video Bible School is in that area, and I had a chance to meet many people who would come there to do filming. One of those that I met was Francis Wachesa. Well, in talking to Kamaro, I found out that Francis Wachesa, who had been there at the Andrew Conley School of Preaching several years ago, was the one who converted Kamaro. Slowly, taught him a little bit more, got him to come to the classes and taught him. So it was kind of interesting that I had met the person several years ago who had converted, or at least the one who had a lot to do with teaching Kamaro. And a fine young man. But the wall there is because there was a factory, and one of the opportunities that was set up for us was a study in the home of the landlord of some of the apartment buildings. Those are the apartment buildings. May not be exactly what you think of as an apartment building, but there it's just a long row, and it's just the one room width. There's a door which is just a hanging sheet there that goes into there, and no, there's not any window on the other side for ventilation. That is the apartment building. That's what they are. But some person had been very enterprising and made those, and was evidently filling them up with people who had moved to that area to work in that factory. Well, we had an opportunity to meet in the home of the man who was the owner of the apartment building. He's the man on the right. His wife is the one on the left. Kamaro was in the middle. And we were told that when we went there, this man was going to invite some people from the apartment complex, if I can call it that. And they did, and they came. 3 young ladies were there, and I forgot that 2 of them were Lutheran, 1 was something different. And they came, and they studied, and we said, can we come back tomorrow? It's amazing how open the people are there. You can do the evangelism by wandering around. You can just go around and meet people and talk to them. In this case, this had been prearranged, and that woman was of some denominational background, but we had some studies, and they're bright people. They seemed to get it. So there's that group with Kamaro in the middle there. And again, there's the apartment building with one of the ladies in the Bible study. That was her apartment there on the end. And I was going to show you one more study just to let you know, yes, Carol and I really were there. There's a picture of us as part of the Bible study. But again, people were very receptive. They would sit, they would listen, they comprehended well. And you say, can I come back tomorrow? And the answer was, oh, sure. We went back the next day. I think 2 out of the 3 young ladies were there that had been there the day before, but another young lady came for the first time. So there's a lot of amazing opportunities there. And that's the apartment owner's house. That's where we were. A much better house than average over there. You see the tin roof. And you may be saying, well, what's that stuff on the side of the wall? It just kind of looks like mud. If you can't stand the answer, don't ask the question. But it's made with dirt, and it's made with water, and it's made with yet another ingredient that seems to give it that strength and that cohesiveness, and in fact seems to make it somewhat waterproof. And that other ingredient is cow dung. So that's what holds the houses together and seems to do really an excellent job of that. A little story. Well, the first day we walked. I don't know, we about about 5 or 6 miles visiting all these different people. And the second day we had some very specific appointments. I guess maybe the timeline was a little closer, but we were able to use one of the vehicles from the school there. But as we were moving around, that's the handy Andy, I guess, as you would encounter it over there. This was the house of a man that we had gone to visit. He had, it was kind of an interesting story, maybe a little bit of a sad story, I hope one that improved. His wife was, he'd been a faithful Christian. He had gone through the preaching school. He was in the same class going through the preaching school there, the Andrew College School of Preaching, as was Camaro, the young man who was with us. But he hadn't been faithful in attendance. His wife was faithful. His wife worked at the school, in fact. But his problem was alcohol. And he hadn't been there in a while, so Camaro, as we do here, or, we should do, people are not there for a while, you go see them. You go visit them. And he had arranged for us to go see him. Well, the first time we went there, he knocked on the door, nobody answered the door. Camaro was knocking and knocking and knocking. Either the guy wasn't there or he wasn't responding to the door. Second day we came back, he was there, opened the door, allowed us in. And it was interesting to talk to him. Of course, I benefited greatly from my understanding of people that have that challenge in their life from my association with the guys out at the Howe Foundation. So I told him about the Howe Foundation, and I told him, there's no quick fix to a problem with alcohol. There's not a 30-day cure. There's not a 60-day cure. You've got to work on your character and your life, and it takes a while. So some of those words were encouraging to him that he's an English teacher. How valuable is a member of the Lord's church over there that's an English teacher? And what a great asset, and what a shame that his talents, although at one time were used productively in the Lord's kingdom, they were not being used that way now. So anyhow, had a chance to go in and meet him. He is the guy on the right, and again, talked to him for a while. The guy on the left, his name's David. He is the preacher for a congregation out near Mount Maywood, also a classmate. And while we were there with Camaro visiting him, this other classmate came by to visit. Now, how good is that? People going by, those who are struggling, those who haven't been faithful in their attendance, people checking on them. People truly seem to care. So we had an opportunity to talk to him. The first time I told you we went to his house, he didn't answer. Either he wasn't there or he wasn't answering. Well, this house was like, 30, 40 feet away. So Kamal, the young man, just went over and knocked on the door and engaged the man in conversation. And although Kamaro did not know him, we certainly didn't know him, he invited us in for a Bible study. So we had a Bible study with him. We said, can we come back tomorrow? And he said, well, if I'm in the area, you can. I may be not at home tomorrow. But we came back the next day to see the wayward member and went to his house, and he wasn't there that day. But, the invitation was there to come back and to further study the Bible. Now, there's me in the middle, Kamar on the left, and the man on the right was involved in another one of the Bible studies. One of them that they had set up was a guy who owned a service station, or at least he was the manager of the service station. And so we went to that place and went to one of the back rooms of the service station. Now, again, this wasn't the man, but this preacher went with us to that study. Evidently, the study had been going on some months before, and it kind of got discontinued for some reason. So I think what they did, they were just opportunistic. They used the appearance of this outsider over there as an opportunity to contact the man and try to get the Bible study going again. So we met with him, and they told me he had a couple of very specific questions. One was about tithing, and one was about mechanical instruments of music. Well, I listened to him, tell me that in fact those were the questions that he had. And so what I did was I said, well, those two are related. And so we talked about the law of Moses. And under the law of Moses, there was a specific percentage for giving, and that was 10% the tithing, but we don't have that under the law of Christ. And so we talked about the law of Moses not having any authority today, and went through several of those passages with him. and said the conclusion was, therefore, we're not bound by that tithing commandment. It's a part of the law of Moses. That law that was for different people of a different time. And under the New Testament of Jesus Christ, we do not find mechanical instruments of music. Maybe you'll turn back into your pages in the Old Testament and find them, but you don't find them in the New Testament. And I was kind of explaining there at the end, and he sort of says, I got it. I think that's what he literally said. He spoke to me. I get it. His Bible, I could see his Bible. His Bible was very marked up. He'd been a man who had been studying the Bible, perhaps one of those who'd been searching, working his way toward the truth, accepting things along the way. But I was impressed with his familiarity he had with the Bible. A bright man, and I went through that with him, and he said, I got it. I get it. So I thought that was a very productive study. Kamara went, and again, this other guy who was a preacher in a different area, and I forgot now exactly where he was, the preacher, but he was a part of that study also. It was nice to work with the young preachers there. Everybody kind of has a different way of approaching things, or different ways that we piece things together. And I really thought that some of the times that I felt most productive was when I was working with Kamaro and talking with him, maybe just in discussions about how to approach things. And he talked to me about maybe some problems or some challenges, and we had a chance to talk about maybe how to handle those. Well, this is Kamaro and his wife. Kamaro wanted us to meet his family. So we were going to do it one day, and we ran out of time because of all the other visits, so we went back the next day to his house specifically to meet him and his wife. And there's his family. And I want you to notice the look that little one is giving his dad there. I thought that was cute. Very friendly people, very nice. And this is the place where he preaches, the Kasongo Church of Christ. And I was asked to go over there on Wednesday night and to teach the Bible class over there, which I did. And I just have a couple of pictures on the inside. This is another picture of Jimmy G's family. Jimmy is not in the picture, but for all those kids that he had, we had an opportunity to eat in their home. Man, you talk about some squared away kids. If you're a young man about 13 or 14 or 15 or 16 years old, you may want to consider going to Africa to get your wife. I tell you, those were some impressive young ladies there. And I'm connected with them on Facebook now, so that's kind of keeps the conversation going. Okay. What I wanted to say was, you go to a place like that, and because of the travel eats up quite a bit of the time, and maybe we only had like a week left, and the flight that was canceled on the way down there, that cost us a day also, and you kind of wonder, in the end, is it worth it? Is it worth the travel time? Is it worth the expense, the things that all of you contributed to? And I wanted to tell you that I believe in the end, I believe it was. Oh, I know the other thing I was going to mention. 2 or 3 reasons. One is, I think that the lessons that I presented on Saturday afternoon, in particular. Oh, I know. In that assembly on Saturday afternoon for the gospel meeting at Arusha, there were 7 different Church of Christ preachers that were there from that area. So I had an opportunity to talk to, speak to not only the members of the congregation there and some visitors they brought, but the people really supported the meeting well with 7 preachers from different areas. And I always love the opportunity to talk about those 2 particular topics. And I've expressed to you my concern that many times the people in our pews, they know what we do, but they do not know why. And if they can't explain why, ultimately, if they're challenged, they're going to abandon it. So I'm always grateful for opportunities to teach and preach, especially those 2 lessons, and I had an opportunity to do that. But at the end of the sermon, their practice there is you have a question and answer session. You get to stand up there and they get to ask you questions, and that's kind of interesting. And the question that one very articulate, very polished man was asking was about the influence that women should have in a congregation, especially when it comes to the selection of a preacher. And I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting question. I mean, think women ought to have an influence. Women, they have to listen to the preachers. Their views should certainly be expressed. But I said when it comes to the decision, in the Bible, men are assigned the leadership role, and the decision should be made by the man. Well, somewhere when I got about there, he made some comment like, well, I don't think we should let these people from out of Africa be setting our policy for us. And I thought, I hit upon a sore subject here. There is somebody who thinks he has influence over quite a few of the women, and he's trying to get them to vote him in as the preacher. Of course, I didn't know any of this, but later I checked and I said, this was kind of my perception. And they said, yeah, that I had sized it up about right. So I told him, I said, well, you shouldn't believe in the outsider, but if I present principles to you from the Bible, then you need to consider those principles. So I think the timing was kind of good, and Tomorrow said that, I thought that the things that I had said were helpful. And I think in the church there's not a bunch of American missionaries that are running that church. One thing that they have done is they have some good Africans there, and they are leaving it to them to kind of work through their problems and work out their problems. And I tell you, in the end, that may very well be the wisest path. Because wherever they get to, then they're going to be there solidly, and they're going to be there because they understand the principles, and they have been able to articulate them, and they hold to those principles as a group. So I was glad that I was there for that question and answer session. Kind of an unexpected benefit, Karina on the back row, Jimmy G's wife, again, she was in a different congregation, so she didn't come to those Saturday afternoon lessons. So what I did was I've learned to take some DVDs of the lessons, because sometimes people aren't there and somebody wants to share it. She listened to them, and now she's asked me, probably the total is up to somewhere around 28 or 29 copies of the DVDs. She's asking me to send them copies of those lessons to people in the U.S. She has friends that are not members of the Lord's church, and she wants them to hear the lessons, and she wants me to send about 20 of them over to her so she can distribute them over there. That was an unexpected benefit. So I thought, if I'm giving them some material that they can use over there, and even if they're wanting to send it to their relatives over here or have me send it to them, I thought that was a good thing. So with that combination of things, I thought, well, maybe you can in a week. Maybe your funds were well expended, and there was a difference that was made in that location because Carol and I were there. And then I got a couple of emails from Tomorrow that were probably the most touching part of the whole journey, and I'm just going to share those with you. Part of them are about you. He says, in his somewhat broken English, he's not the one that was the English teacher. He says, I am happy that you have reached home safe with your wife. We had very good Sunday, and all the people we visited have attended Sunday worship. Now, I thought I smiled for about an hour after I read that. So I'm very happy that you have done a big part in Kasango Church. May God bless you and all those who helped you get to Tanzania. That is you. I got another one later. He says, I am praying to God that you may come back to Africa. My family was so happy for the visitation, and that fellowship is making me to love God and the church more. I enjoyed talking to that young man. He has got a good spiritual direction in his life. So thank you all. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your interest before we went. Thank you for your interest after we got back and the experiences we had. Thank you for your encouragement. And thank you for your financial support. And I really appreciate that you helped me to get there, and I really appreciate the fact that you helped us gather up enough funds for Carol to go along too. That was a very great helpful part of the work. You've helped share the gospel in Africa. But we need to be sharing the gospel around here. And sometimes we've shared the gospel with people, and some of those have begun to attend with us, and some of those visit with us. And when we hear the gospel message, it's not enough just to hear the message. It doesn't do any good to spread the message necessarily. It doesn't do any good to hear the message if you don't respond to the message. So if they're there here this evening, there are some here this evening who have heard the message. You've heard us talk about God's plan for man's salvation that you have to hear. You have to repent, Luke 13:3. You have to confess, Matthew 10:32. You have to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, Acts 2:38. There's some here this evening and you've not done that, do it without delay. We talked about Ethiopia. We remember that Ethiopian nobleman said, stop the chariot. He was unwilling to delay even until he got back home to be baptized. Every baptism is an emergency baptism because a person's soul is at stake. If we can help you in some way this evening, we'll be glad to try to do that if you come forward as we